Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. I am your host and guide, Mr. Crispy, speaking to you through uncanny frequencies and sharing with you stories strange, fascinating, and terrifying. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour is an entertainment program, and any similarities to any person living or dead, or any place or events, are entirely coincidental. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour was created except as indicated by Matt Henshaw. Listener discretion is advised.
And now, come have a seat on Santa Crispy's lap. Ignore the worms crawling in my moldering beard, and join me for the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour Victorian Holiday Special. The Last Christmas. On this chilly night, winter's blight erases the barren ground from sight. On the horizon there I see the glow of a distant galaxy, greens and reds reflecting sinisterly. I hear on the air a wheezing cough, followed by an evil laugh, full of menace and mirth, old and tough. One star in the heavens outshines the rest. It causes tightness in my chest, puts my sanity to the test. Rising from the frozen ground, I hear an infernal choir sound, summoning the master to come around. This winter night is far too much, with demons, devils, witches, and such. Their cold pale fingers my heart they touch. In bed I start, was that a dream? Has the world gone as wicked as it seems? I fear it is so. Outside I hear horrified screams. And so we celebrate this final holiday. My tongue struck dumb, I cannot say what horrors await us on this last Christmas Day. Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. You know, my dears, that your mother was an orphan and an only child, and I dare say you have heard that your grandfather was a clergyman up in Westmoreland, where I come from. I was just a girl in the village school when, one day, your grandmother came in to ask the mistress if there was any scholar there who would do for a nursemaid. And mighty proud I was, I can tell you, when the mistress called me up and spoke to my being a good girl at my needle, and a steady, honest girl, and one whose parents were very respectable, though they might be poor. I thought I should like nothing better than to serve the pretty young lady who was blushing as deep as I was, as she spoke of the coming baby, and what I should have to do with it. However, I see you don't care so much for this part of my story as for what you think is to come, so I'll tell you at once. I was engaged and settled at the parsonage before Miss Rosamond, that was the baby who is now your mother, was born. To be sure, I had little enough to do with her when she came, for she was never out of her mother's arms, and slept by her all night long. And proud enough was I sometimes when Mrs. trusted her to me. There never was such baby before or since, though you've all of you been fine enough in your turns. But for sweet winning ways, you've none of you come up to your mother. She took after her mother, who was a real lady born, a Miss Furnivall, a granddaughter of Lord Furnivall's in Northumberland. I believe she had neither brother nor sister, and had been brought up in my lord's family till she had married your grandfather, who was just a curate, son to a shopkeeper in Carlisle, but a clever, fine gentleman as ever was, and one who was a right-down hard worker in his parish, which was very wide, and scattered all abroad over the Westmoreland fells. When your mother, little Rosamond, was about 4 or 5 years old, Both her parents died in a fortnight, one after the other. Ah, that was a sad time. My pretty young mistress and me was looking for another baby, when my master came home from one of his long rides, wet and tired, and took the fever he died of. And then she never held up her head again, but just lived to see her dead baby, and have it laid on her breast before she sighed away her life. My mistress had asked me on her deathbed never to leave Miss Rosamond, but if she had never spoken a word, I would have gone with the little child to the end of the world. The next thing, and before we had well stilled our sobs, the executors and guardians came to settle the affairs. They were my poor young mistress's own cousin, Lord Furnivall, and Miss Esthwaite, my master's brother, a shopkeeper in Manchester, not so well-to-do then as he was afterwards, and with a large family rising about him. Well, I don't know if it were their settling, or because of a letter my mistress wrote on her deathbed to her cousin, my lord, but somehow it was settled that Miss Rosamond and me were to go to Furnivall Manor House in Northumberland, and my lord spoke as if it had been her mother's wish that she should live with his family, and as if he had no objections, for that one or two more or less could make no difference in so grand a household. So, though that was not the way in which I should have wished the coming of my bright and pretty pet to have been looked at, who was like a sunbeam in my family, be it never so grand, I was well pleased that all the folks in the dale should stare and admire, when they heard I was going to be young lady's maid at my Lord Furnivall's at Furnivall Manor. But I made a mistake in thinking we were to go and live where my lord did. It turned out that the family had left Furnivall Manor House 50 years or more. I could not hear that my poor young mistress had ever been there, though she had been brought up in the family, and I was sorry for that, for I should have liked Miss Rosamond's youth to have passed where her mother's had been. My lord's gentleman, from whom I asked so many questions as I durst, said that the manor house was at the foot of the Cumberland Fells, and a very grand place, that an old Miss Furnivall, a great aunt of my lord's, lived there, with only a few servants, but that it was a very healthy place, and my lord had thought that it would suit Miss Rosamond very well for a few years, and that her being there might perhaps amuse his old aunt. I was bidden by my lord to have Miss Rosamond's things ready by a certain day. He was a stern, proud man, as they say all the Lords Furnivall were, and he never spoke a word more than was necessary. Folk did say he had loved my young mistress, because she knew that his father would object. She would never listen to him, and married Mr. Esthwaite. But I don't know. He never married at any rate, but he never took much notice of Miss Rosamond, which I thought he might have done if he had cared for her dead mother. He sent his gentleman with us to the manor house, telling him to join him at Newcastle that same evening. So there was no great length of time for him to make us known to all the strangers before he, too, shook us off. And we were left, two lonely young things, I was not 18, in the great old manor house. It seems like yesterday that we drove there. We had left our own dear parsonage very early, and we had both cried as if our hearts would break, though we were traveling in my lord's carriage, which I thought so much of once. And now it was long past noon on a September day, and we stopped to change horses for the last time at a little smoky town, all full of colliers and miners. Miss Rosamond had fallen asleep, but Mr. Henry told me to waken her, that she might see the park and the manor house as we drove up. I thought it rather a pity, but I did what he bade me, for fear he should complain of me to my lord. We had left all signs of a town, or even a village, and were then inside the gates of a large wild park, not like the parks here in the north, but with rocks, and the noise of running water, and gnarled thorn trees, and old oaks, all white and peeled with age. The road went up about 2 miles, and then we saw a great and stately house, with many trees close around it, so close that in some places their branches dragged against the walls when the wind blew, and some hung broken down, for no one seemed to take much charge of the place to lop the wood or to keep the moss-covered carriage-way in order. Only in front of the house all was clear. The great oval drive was without a weed, and neither tree nor creeper was allowed to grow over the long many-windowed front, at both sides of which a wing projected, which were each the ends of other side fronts. For the house, although it was so desolate, was even grander than I expected. Behind it rose the fells, which seemed unenclosed and bare enough, and on the left hand of the house, as you stood facing it, was a little old-fashioned flower garden, as I found out afterwards. A door opened out upon it from the west front, and it had been scooped out of the thick dark wood for some old Lady Furnival, but the branches of the great forest trees had grown and overshadowed it again, and there were very few flowers that would live there at that time. When we drove up to the great front entrance and went into the hall, I thought we should be lost. It was so large and vast and grand. There was a chandelier all of bronze hung down from the middle of the ceiling, and I had never seen one before, and looked at it all in amaze. Then, at one end of the hall was a great fireplace, as large as the sides of the houses in my country, with massy andirons and dogs to hold the wood, and by it were heavy old-fashioned sofas. At the opposite end of the hall, to the left as you went in on the western side, was an organ built into the wall, and so large that it filled up the best part of that end. Beyond it, on the same side, was a door, and opposite, on each side of the fireplace, were also doors leading to the east front. But those I never went through as long as I stayed in the house, so I can't tell you what lay beyond. The afternoon was closing in, and the hall, which had no fire lighted in it, looked dark and gloomy. But we did not stay there a moment. The old sea-cant who had opened the door for us bowed to Mr. Henry, and took us in through the door at the further side of the great organ, and led us through several smaller halls and passages into the west drawing-room, where he said that Miss Furnival was sitting. Poor little Miss Rosamond held very tight to me, as if she were scared and lost in that great place, and as for myself, I was not much better. The west drawing-room was very cheerful-looking, with a warm fire in it, and plenty of good, comfortable furniture about. Miss Furnival was an old lady not far from 80, I should think, but I do not know. She was thin and tall, and had a face as full of fine wrinkles as if they had been drawn all over it with a needle's point. Her eyes were very watchful, to make up, I suppose, for her being so deaf as to be obliged to use a trumpet. Sitting with her, working at the same great piece of tapestry, was Mrs. Stark, her maid and companion, and almost as old as she was. She had lived with Miss Furnival ever since they were both young, and now she seemed more like a friend than a sea-cant. She looked so cold and gray and stony as if she had never loved or cared for anyone. And I don't suppose she did care for anyone except her mistress, and owing to the great deafness of the latter, Mrs. Stark treated her very much as if she were a child. Mr. Henry gave some message from my lord, and then he bowed good-bye to us, all taking no notice of my sweet little Miss Rosamond's outstretched hand, and left us standing there, being looked at by the two old ladies through their spectacles. I was right glad when they rung for the old footman, who had shown us in at first, and told him to take us to our rooms. So we went out of that great drawing-room and into another sitting-room, and out of that, and then up a great flight of stairs, and along a broad gallery which was something like a library, having books all down one side and windows and writing-tables all down the other, till we came to our rooms, which I was not sorry to hear were just over the kitchens, for I began to think I should be lost in that wilderness of a house. There was an old nursery that had been used for all the little lords and ladies long ago, with a pleasant fire burning in the grate, and the kettle boiling on the hob, and tea-things spread out on the table, and out of that room was the night nursery, with a little crib for Miss Rosamond close to my bed. And old James called up Dorothy, his wife, to bid us welcome, and both he and she were so hospitable and kind, that by and by Miss Rosamond and me felt quite at home, and by the time tea was over, she was sitting on Dorothy's knee, and chattering away as fast as her little tongue could go. I soon found out that Dorothy was from Westmoreland, and that bound her and me together, as it were, and I would never wish to meet with kinder people than were old James and his wife. James had lived pretty nearly all his life in my lord's family, and thought there was no one so grand as they. He even looked down a little on his wife, because till he had married her, she had never lived in any but a farmer's household. But he was very fond of her, as well he might be. They had one servant under them to do all the rough work. Agnes they called her, and she and me and James and Dorothy, with Miss Furnivall and Mrs. Stark, made up the family, always remembering my sweet little Miss Rosamond. I used to wonder what they had done before she came. They thought so much of her now. Kitchen and drawing room, it was all the same. The hard, sad Miss Furnivall and the cold Mrs. Stark looked pleased when she came fluttering in like a bird, playing and pranking hither and thither, with a continual murmur and pretty prattle of gladness. I am sure they were sorry many a time when she flitted away into the kitchen, though they were too proud to ask her to stay with them, and were a little surprised at her taste. I thought, to be sure, as Mrs. Stark said, it was not to be wondered at. I, remembering what stock her father had come of. The great old rambling house was a famous place for little Miss Rosamond. She made expeditions all over it, with me at her heels, all except the east wing, which was never opened, and whither we never thought of going. But in the western and northern part was many a pleasant room, full of things that were curiosities to us, though they might not have been to people who had seen more. The windows were darkened by the sweeping boughs of the trees and the ivy which had overgrown them, but in the green gloom we could manage to see old china jars and caned ivory boxes, and great heavy books, and above all the old pictures. Once I remember my darling would have Dorothy go with us to tell us who they all were, for they were all portraits of some of my lord's family, though Dorothy could not tell us the names of every one. We had gone through most of the rooms when we came to the old state drawing-room over the hall, and there was a picture of Miss Furnivall, or, as she was called in those days, Miss Grace, for she was the younger sister. Such a beauty she must have been, but with such a set, proud look, and such scorn looking out of her handsome eyes, with her eyebrows just a little raised, as if she were wondering how any one could have the impertinence to look at her, and her lip curled at us as we stood there gazing. She had a dress on the like of which I had never seen before, but it was all the fashion when she was young. A hat of some white stuff like beaver pulled a little over her brows, and a beautiful plume of feathers sweeping round it on one side, and her gown of blue satin was open in front to a quilted white stomacher. "Well, to be sure," said I, when I had gazed my fill, "flesh is grass, they do say, but who would have thought that Miss Furnivall had been such an out-and-out beauty to see her now?" "Yes," said Dorothy, "folks change sadly. But if what my master's father used to say was true, Miss Furnivall, the elder sister, was handsomer than Miss Grace. Her picture is here somewhere, but if I show it to you, you must never let on, even to James, that you have seen it. Can the little lady hold her tongue, think you?" asked she. I was not so sure, for she was such a little sweet, bold, open-spoken child, so I set her to hide herself, and then I helped Dorothy to turn a great picture that leaned with its face towards the wall, and was not hung up as the others were. To be sure, it beat Miss Grace for beauty, and I think for scornful pride too, though in that matter it might be hard to choose. I could have looked at it an hour, but Dorothy seemed half frightened at having shown it to me, and hurried it back again, and bade me run and find Miss Rosamond, for that there were some ugly places about the house where she should like ill for the child to go. I was a brave, high-spirited girl, and thought little of what the old woman said, for I liked hide-and-seek as well as any child in the parish, so off I ran to find my little one. As winter drew on, and the days grew shorter, I was sometimes almost certain that I heard a noise as if someone was playing on the great organ in the hall. I did not hear it every evening, but certainly I did very often. Usually when I was sitting with Miss Rosamond, after I had put her to bed, and keeping quite still and silent in the bedroom. Then I used to hear it booming and swelling away in the distance. The first night, when I went down to my supper, I asked Dorothy who had been playing music, and James said very shortly that I was a gawk to take the wind soughing among the trees for music. But I saw Dorothy look at him very fearfully, and Bossy, the kitchen maid, said something beneath her breath, and went quite white. I saw they did not like my question, so I held my peace till I was with Dorothy alone, when I knew I could get a good deal out of her. So the next day I watched my time, and I coaxed and asked her who it was that played the organ, for I knew that it was the organ and not the wind well enough, for all I had kept silence before James. But Dorothy had had her lesson, and never said a word could I get from her. So then I tried Bossy, though I had always held my head rather above her, as I was even to James and Dorothy, and she was little better than their servant. So she said I must never, never tell, and if I ever told, I was never to say she had told me. But it was a very strange noise, and she had heard it many a time, but most of all on winter nights, and before storms. And folks did say it was the old lord playing on the great organ in the hall, just as he used to do when he was alive. But who the old lord was, or why he played, and why he played on stormy winter evenings in particular, she either could not or would not tell me. Well, I told you I have a brave heart, and I thought it was rather pleasant to have that grand music rolling around the house, let who would be the player. For now it rose above the great gusts of wind, and wailed and triumphed just like a living creature, and then it fell to a softness most complete. Only it was always music and tunes, so it was nonsense to call it the wind. I thought at first that it might be Miss Furnivall who played, unknown to Bossy. But one day, when I was in the hall by myself, I opened the organ and peeped all about it and around it, as I had done to the organ in Crosswaith Church once before, and I saw it was all broken and destroyed inside, though it looked so brave and fine, and then, though it was noonday, my flesh began to creep a little, and I shut it up, and ran away pretty quickly to my own bright nursery. And I did not like hearing the music for some time after that, any more than James and Dorothy did. All this time Miss Rosamond was making herself more and more beloved. The old ladies liked her to dine with them at their early dinner. James stood behind Miss Furnivall's chair, and I behind Miss Rosamond's, all in state. And after dinner she would play about in a corner of the great drawing-room, as still as any mouse, while Miss Furnivall slept, and I had my dinner in the kitchen. But she was glad enough to come to me in the nursery afterwards, for, as she said, Miss Furnivall was so sad, and Mrs. Stark so dull. But she and I were merry enough, and by, I got not to care for that weird rolling music, which did one no harm, if we did not know where it came from. That winter was very cold. In the middle of October the frosts began, and lasted many, many weeks. I remember one day at dinner, Miss Furnivall lifted up her sad, heavy eyes, and said to Mrs. Stark, "I am afraid we shall have a terrible winter," in a strange kind of meaning way. But Mrs. Stark pretended not to hear, and talked very loud of something else. My little lady and I did not care for the frost, not we. As long as it was dry, we climbed up the steep brows behind the house, and went up on the fells, which were bleak and bare enough, and there we ran races in the fresh sharp air. And once we came down by a new path that took us past the 2 old gnarled holly trees, which grew about halfway down by the east side of the house. But the days grew shorter and shorter, and the old lord, if it was he, played more and more stormily and sadly on the great organ. One Sunday afternoon, it must have been towards the end of November, I asked Dorothy to take charge of little Missy when she came out of the drawing-room, after Miss Furnivall had had her nap, for it was too cold to take her with me to church, and I yet wanted to go. And Dorothy was glad enough to promise, and was so fond of the child that all seemed well, and Bossy and I set off very briskly, though the sky hung heavy and black over the white earth, as if the night had never fully gone away, and the air, though still, was very biting and keen. "We shall have a fall of snow," said Bossy to me, and sure enough, even while we were in church, it came down thick, in great large flakes, so thick it almost darkened the windows. It had stopped snowing before we came out, but it lay soft, thick, and deep beneath our feet as we tramped home. Before we got to the hall, the moon rose, and I think it was lighter then, what with the moon and what with the white dazzling snow, than it had been when we went to church, between 2 and 3 o'clock. I have not told you that Miss Furnivall and Mrs. Stark never went to church. They used to read their prayers together in their quiet, gloomy way. They seemed to take the Sunday very long without their tapestry work to be busy at. So when I went to Dorothy in the kitchen to fetch Miss Rosamond and take her upstairs with me, I did not much wonder when the old woman told me that the ladies had kept the child with them, and that she had never come to the kitchen, as I had bidden her, when she was tired of behaving pretty in the drawing-room. So I took off my things and went to find her, and bring her to supper in the nursery. But when I went into the best drawing-room, there sat the 2 old ladies, very still and quiet, dropping out a word now and then, but looking as if nothing so bright and merry as Miss Rosamond had ever been near them. Still, I thought, she might be hiding away from me. It was one of her pretty ways, and that she had persuaded them to look as if they knew nothing about her. So I went softly peeping under the sofa and behind that chair, making believe I was sadly frightened at not finding her. "What's the matter, Hester?" said Mrs. Stark sharply. I don't know if Miss Furnivall had seen me, for, as I told you, she was very deaf, and she sat quite still, idly staring into the fire, with her hopeless face. "I'm only looking for my little Rosy-Posy," replied I, still thinking that the child was there and near me, though I could not see her. "Miss Rosamond is not here," said Mrs. Stark. "She went away more than an hour ago to find Dorothy." And she too turned and went on looking into the fire. My heart sank at this, and I began to wish I had never left my darling. I went back to Dorothy and told her. James was gone for the day, but she and me and Bossy took lights and went up into the nursery first, and then we roamed over the great large house, calling and entreating Miss Rosamond to come out of her hiding place, and not frighten us to death in that way. But there was no answer, no sound. "Oh," said I at last, "can she have got into the east wing and hidden there?" But Dorothy said it was not possible, for that she herself had never been there, that the doors were always locked, and my lord steward had the keys, she believed. At any rate, neither she nor James had ever seen them. So I said I would go back and see if after all she was not hidden in the drawing-room, unknown to the old ladies. And if I found her there, I said I would whip her well for the fright she had given me. But I never meant to do it. Well, I went back to the west drawing-room, and I told Mrs. Stark we could not find her anywhere, and asked for leave to look all about the furniture there, for I thought now that she might have fallen asleep in some warm hidden corner. But no, we looked. Miss Furnivall got up and looked, trembling all over, and she was nowhere there. Then we set off again, every one in the house, and looked in all the places we had searched before, but we could not find her. Miss Furnivall shivered and shook so much that Mrs. Stark took her back into the warm drawing-room, but not before they made me promise to bring her to them when she was found. Well-a-day, I began to think she never would be found, when I bethought me to look out into the great front court, all covered with snow. I was upstairs when I looked out, but it was such a clear moonlight I could see quite plain 2 little footprints, which might be traced from the hall door and round the corner of the east wing. I don't know how I got down, but I tugged open the great stiff hall door, and, throwing the skirt of my gown over my head for a cloak, I ran out. I turned the east corner, and there a black shadow fell on the snow. But when I came again into the moonlight, there were the little footmarks going up to the fells. It was bitter cold, so cold that the air almost took the skin off of my face as I ran. But I ran on, crying to think how my poor little darling must be perished and frightened. I was within sight of the holly trees when I saw a shepherd coming down the hill, bearing something in his arms wrapped in his maud. He shouted at me and asked me if I had lost a bairn, and when I could not speak for crying, he bore towards me, and I saw my wee bairnie laying still, and white and stiff in his arms as if she had been dead. He told me he had been up to the fells to gather in his sheep before the deep cold of night came on, and that under the holly trees, black marks on the hillside where no other bush was for miles around, he had found my little lady, my lamb, my queen, my darling, stiff and cold in the terrible sleep which is frost-begotten. Oh, the joy and the tears of having her in my arms once again, for I would not let him carry her, but took her, maud and all, into my arms, and held her near my own warm neck and heart, and felt the life stealing slowly back again into her little gentle limbs. But she was still insensible when we reached the hall, and I had no breath for speech. We went in by the kitchen door. "Bring the warming pan," said I, and I carried her upstairs and began undressing her by the nursery fire, which Bossy had kept up. I called my little lammy all the sweet and playful names I could think of, even while my eyes were blinded by my tears. And at length she opened her large blue eyes. Then I put her into her warm bed, and sent Dorothy down to tell Mrs. Furnivall that all was well, and I made up my mind to sit by my darling's bedside the livelong night. She fell away into a soft sleep as soon as her pretty head had touched the pillow, and I watched by her until morning light, when she wakened up bright and clear, or so I thought at first, and, my dear, so I think now. She said that she had fancied that she should like to go to Dorothy, for that both the old ladies were asleep, and it was very dull in the drawing-room, and that, as she was going through the west lobby, she saw the snow through the high window falling soft and steady. But she wanted to see it lying pretty and white on the ground, so she made her way into the great hall, and then going to the window she saw it bright and soft upon the drive. But while she stood there, she saw a little girl, not so old as she was, but so pretty, said my darling. And this little girl beckoned to me to come out, and oh, she was so pretty and so sweet. I could not choose but go. And then this other little girl had taken her by the hand, and side by side the two had gone round the east corner. "Now you are a naughty little girl and telling stories," said I. "What would your good mamma that is in heaven and never told a story in her life say to the little Rosamond, if she heard her, and I dare say she does, telling stories?" "Indeed, Hester," sobbed out my child, "I'm telling you true. Indeed I am." "Don't tell me," said I, very stern. "I tracked you by your footmarks through the snow, and there were only yours to be seen. And if you had had a little girl to go hand in hand with you up the hill, don't you think the footprints would have gone along with yours?" "I can't help it, dear, dear Hester," she said, crying. "If they did not, I never looked at her feet, but she held my hand fast and tight in her little one, and it was very, very cold. She took me up the fell path, up to the holly trees, and there I saw a lady weeping and crying. But when she saw me, she hushed her weeping and smiled very proud and grand, and took me on her knee, and began to lull me to sleep. And that's all, Hester, but that is true, and my dear mamma knows it is," said she, crying. So I thought the child was in a fever, and pretended to believe her, as she went over her story over and over again, and always the same. At last Dorothy knocked at the door with Miss Rosamond's breakfast, and she told me the old ladies were down in the eating parlour, and that they wanted to speak to me. They had both been into the night nursery the evening before, but it was after Miss Rosamond was asleep, so they had only looked at her, not asked me any questions. I shall catch it, thought I to myself, and I went along the north gallery. And yet, I thought, taking courage, it was in their charge I left her, and it's they that's to blame for letting her steal away unknown and unwatched. So I went in boldly and told my story. I told it all to Miss Furnivall, shouting it close to her ear. But when I came to the mention of the other little girl out in the snow, coaxing and tempting her out, and willing her up to the grand and beautiful lady by the holly tree, She threw her arms up, her old and withered arms, and cried aloud, "Oh, heaven, forgive! Have mercy!" Mrs. Stark took hold of her, roughly enough, I thought, but she was past Mrs. Stark's management, and spoke to me in a kind of wild warning and authority. "Hester, keep her from that child. It will lure her to her death. That evil child. Tell her it is a wicked, naughty child." Then Mrs. Stark hurried me out of the room, where, indeed, I was glad enough to go. But Miss Furnivall kept shrieking out, "Oh, have mercy! Wilt thou never forgive? It is many a long year ago." I was very uneasy in my mind, and after that I durst never leave Miss Rosamond night or day for fear lest she might slip off again, after some fancy or other, and all the more because I thought I could make out that Miss Furnivall was crazy, from their odd ways about her, and I was afraid lest something of the same kind, which might be in the family, you know, hung over my darling. And the great frost never ceased all this time, and whenever it was a more stormy night than usual, between the gusts and through the wind, we heard the old lord playing on the great organ. But, old lord or not, wherever Miss Rosamond went, there I followed, for my love for her, pretty helpless orphan, was stronger than my fear for the grand and terrible sound. Besides, it rested with me to keep her cheerful and merry, as beseemed her age. So we played together and wandered together, here and there and everywhere, for I never dared to lose sight of her again in that large and rambling house. And so it happened that one afternoon, not long before Christmas Day, we were playing together on the billiard table in the great hall. Not that we knew the way of playing, but she liked to roll the smooth ivory balls with her pretty hands, and I liked to do whatever she did. And by, without our noticing it, it grew dusk indoors, though it was still light in the open air, and I was thinking of taking her back into the nursery when all of a sudden she cried out, "Look, Hester, look! There is my poor little girl out in the snow." I turned towards the long narrow windows, and there, sure enough, I saw a little girl, less than my Miss Rosamond, dressed all unfit to be out of doors, such bitter night crying, and beating against the window panes, as if she wanted to be let in. She seemed to sob and wail till Miss Rosamond could bear it no longer, and was flying to the door to open it, when all of a sudden, and close up upon us, the great organ pealed out so loud and thundering it fairly made me tremble. And all the more when I remembered me that, even in the stillness of that dead cold weather, I had heard no sound of little battering hands upon the window glass, although the phantom child had seemed to put forth all its force, and although I had seen it wail and cry, no faintest touch of sound had fallen upon my ears. Whether I remembered all this at the very moment, I do not know. The great organ sound had stunned me into terror, but this I know. I caught up Miss Rosamond before she got the hall door opened, and clutched her, and carried her away, kicking and screaming, into the large bright kitchen, where Dorothy and Agnes were busy with their mince pies. "What is the matter with my sweet one?" cried Dorothy, as I bore in Miss Rosamond, who was sobbing as if her heart would break. "She won't let me open the door for my little girl to come in, and she'll die if she is out on the fells all night. Cruel, naughty Hester," she said, slapping me, and she might have struck harder, for I had seen a look of ghastly terror on Dorothy's face, which made my very blood run cold. "Shut the back kitchen door fast, and bolt it well," said she to Agnes. She said no more. She gave me raisins and almonds to quiet Miss Rosamond, but she sobbed about the little girl in the snow, and would not touch any of the good things. I was thankful when she cried herself to sleep in bed. Then I stole down to the kitchen and told Dorothy I'd made up my mind. I would carry my darling back to my father's house in Applethwaite, where, if we lived humbly, we lived in peace. I said I had been frightened enough with the old lord's organ playing, but now that I had seen for myself this little moaning child, all decked out as no child in the neighborhood could be, beating and battering to get in, yet always without any sound or noise, with the dark wound on its right shoulder, and that Miss Rosamond had known it again for the phantom that had nearly lured her to death, which Dorothy knew was true, I would stand it no longer. I saw Dorothy change color once or twice. When I had done, she told me she did not think I could take Miss Rosamond with me, for that she was my lord's ward, and I had no right over her. and she asked me would I leave the child that I was so fond of just for sounds and sights that could do me no harm, and that they had all had to get used to in their turns. I was all in a hot, trembling passion, and I said it was very well for her to talk, that knew what these sights and noises betokened, and that had perhaps had something to do with the spectre child while it was alive. And I taunted her so that she told me all she knew at last, and then I wished I had never been told, for it only made me afraid more than ever. She said she had heard the tale from old neighbors that were alive when she was first married, when folks used to come to the hall sometimes, before it got such a bad name on the countryside. It might not be true, or it might, what she had been told. The old lord was Miss Furnivall's father, Miss Grace as Dorothy called her, for Miss Maud was the elder and Miss Furnivall by rights. The old lord was eaten up with pride. Such a proud man was never seen or heard of, and his daughters were like him. No one was good enough to wed them, although they had choice enough, for they were the great beauties of their day, as I had seen by their portraits, where they hung in the state drawing-room. But, as the old saying is, pride will have a fall, and these two haughty beauties fell in love with the same man, and he no better than a foreign musician whom their father had down from London to play music with him at the manor house. For above all things next to his pride, the old lord loved music. He could play on nearly every instrument that ever was heard of, and it was a strange thing it did not soften him. But he was a fierce, dour old man, and had broken his poor wife's heart with his cruelty, they said. He was mad after music, and would pay any money for it. So he got this foreigner to come, who had made such beautiful music, that they said the very birds on the trees stopped their singing to listen. And by degrees this foreign gentleman got such a hold over the old lord that nothing would serve him, but that he must come every year, and it was he that had the great organ brought from Holland and built up in the hall, where it stood now. He taught the old lord to play on it, but many and many a time, when Lord Furnivall was thinking of nothing but his fine organ and his finer music, the dark foreigner was walking abroad in the woods with one of the young ladies, now Miss Maud and then Miss Grace. Miss Maud won the day and carried off the prize such as it was, and he and she were married all unknown to anyone, and before he made his next yearly visit she had been confined of a little girl at a farmhouse on the moors, while her father and Miss Grace thought she was away at Doncaster races. But though she was a wife and a mother, she was not a bit softened, but as haughty and as passionate as ever, and perhaps more so, for she was jealous of Miss Grace, to whom her foreign husband paid a deal of court by way of blinding her, as he told his wife. But Miss Grace triumphed over Miss Maud, and Miss Maud grew fiercer and fiercer, both with her husband and with her sister, and the former, who could easily shake off what was disagreeable and hide himself in the foreign countries, went away a month before his usual time that summer, and half threatened that he would never come back again. Meanwhile the little girl was left at the farmhouse, and her mother used to have her horse saddled and gallop wildly over the hills to see her once every week, at the very least, for where she loved, and where she hated. And the old lord went on playing on his organ, and the servants thought the sweet music he made had soothed down his awful temper, of which, Dorothy said, some terrible tales could be told. He grew infirm, too, and had to walk with a crutch, and his son, that was the present Lord of Furnivall's father, was with the army in America, and the other son at sea. So Miss Maud had it pretty much her own way, and she and Miss Grace grew colder and bitterer to each other every day, till at last they hardly ever spoke, except when the old lord was by. The foreign musician came again the next summer, but it was for the last time, for they led him such a life with their jealousy and their passions, that he grew weary and went away, and never was heard of again. And Miss Maud, who had always meant to have her marriage acknowledged when her father should be dead, was left now a deserted wife whom nobody knew to have been married with a child that she dared not own, although she loved it to distraction, living with a father whom she feared and a sister whom she hated. When the next summer passed over and the dark foreigner never came, both Miss Maud and Miss Grace grew gloomy and sad. They had a haggard look about them, though they looked handsome as ever. But by and by Miss Maud brightened, for her father grew more and more infirm, and more than ever carried away by his music. And she and Miss Grace lived almost entirely apart, having separate rooms, the one on the west side, Miss Maud on the east, those very rooms which were now shut up. So she thought she might have her little girl with her, and no one need ever know except those who dared not speak about it, and were bound to believe that it was, as she said, a cottager's child she had taken a fancy to. All this, Dorothy said, was pretty well known, but what came afterwards no one knew except Miss Grace and Mrs. Stark, who was even then her maid, and much more of a friend to her than ever her sister had been. But the servants supposed from words that were dropped that Miss Maud had triumphed over Miss Grace, and told her that all the time the dark foreigner had been mocking her with pretended love. He was her own husband. The color left Miss Grace's cheek and lips that very day forever, and she was heard to say many a time that sooner or later she would have her revenge, and Mrs. Stark was forever spying about the east rooms. One fearful night, just after the new year had come in, when the snow was lying thick and deep, and the flakes were still falling, fast enough to blind anyone who might be out and abroad, there was a great and violent noise heard, and the old lord's voice above all, cursing and swearing awfully, and the cries of a little child, and the proud defiance of a fierce woman, and the sound of a blow, and a dead stillness, and moans and wailings dying away on the hillside. Then the old lord summoned all his servants and told them with terrible oaths and words more terrible that his daughter had disgraced herself, and that he had turned her out of the doors, her and her child, and that if ever they gave her help, or food, or shelter, he prayed that they might never enter heaven. And all the while Miss Grace stood by him, white and still as any stone, and when he had ended she heaved a great sigh, as much as to say her work was done, and her end was accomplished. But the old lord never touched his organ again, and died within the year, and no wonder, for on the morrow of that wild and fearful night, the shepherds, coming down the fell-side, found Miss Maud sitting, all crazy and smiling, under the holly trees, nursing a dead child, with a terrible mark on its right shoulder. But that was not what killed it, said Dorothy. It was the frost and the cold. Every wild creature was in its hole, and every beast in its fold, while the child and its mother were turned out to wander on the fells. And now you know all, and I wonder if you are less frightened now. I was more frightened than ever, but I said I was not. I wished Miss Rosamond and myself well out of that dreadful house forever, but I would not leave her, and I dared not take her away. But oh, how I watched her and guarded her. We bolted the doors and shut the window shutters fast, an hour or more before dark, rather than leave them open 5 minutes too late. But my little lady still heard the weird child crying and mourning, and not all we could do or say could keep her from wanting to go to her and let her in from the cruel wind and the snow. All this time I kept away from Miss Furnivall and Mrs. Stark as much as ever I could, for I feared them. I knew no good could be about them, with their gray, hard faces and their dreamy eyes looking back into the ghastly years that were gone. But, even in my fear, I had a kind of pity for Miss Furnivall at least. Those gone down to the pit can hardly have a more helpless look than that which was ever on her face. At last I even got so sorry for her, who never said a word but what was quite forced from her, that I prayed for her, and I taught Miss Rosamond to pray for one who had done a deadly sin. But often when she came to those words, she would listen, and start up from her knees, and say, "I hear my little girl plaining and crying, very sad. Oh, let her in, or she will die." One night, just after New Year's Day had come at last, and the long winter had taken a turn, as I hoped, I heard the west drawing-room bell ring 3 times, which was a signal for me. I would not leave Miss Rosamond alone, for all she was asleep, for the old lord had been playing wilder than ever, and I feared lest my darling should waken to hear the spectre child. See her, I knew she could not. I had fastened the windows too well for that. So I took her out of her bed and wrapped her up in such outer clothes as were most handy, and carried her down to the drawing-room, where the old lady sat at their tapestry work as usual. They looked up when I came in, and Mrs. Stark asked, quite astounded, why did I bring Miss Rosamond there, out of her warm bed? I had begun to whisper, because I was afraid of her being tempted out while I was away by the wild child in the snow, when she stopped me short with a glance at Miss Furnivall, and said Miss Furnivall wanted me to undo some work she had done wrong, and which neither of them could see to unpick. So I laid my pretty dear on the sofa, and sat down on a stool by them, and hardened my heart against them as I heard the wind rising and howling. Miss Rosamond slept on sound, for all the wind blew so, and Miss Furnivall never said a word, nor looked round when the gusts shook the windows. All at once she started up to her full height, put up one hand as if to bid us listen. "I hear voices," said she. "I hear terrible screams. I hear my father's voice." Just at that moment my darling wakened with a sudden start. "My little girl is crying. Oh, how she is crying!" And she tried to get up and go to her. But she got her feet entangled in the blanket, and I had caught her up, for my flesh had begun to creep at those noises, which they heard while we could catch no sound. In a minute or two the noises came and gathered fast and filled our ears. We, too, heard the voices and screams, and no longer heard the winter's wind that raged abroad. Mrs. Stark looked at me, and I at her, but we dared not speak. Suddenly Miss Furnivall went towards the door, out into the anteroom, through the west lobby, and opened the door into the great hall. Mrs. Stark followed, and I durst not be left, though my heart almost stopped beating for fear. I wrapped my darling tight in my arms, and went out with them. In the hall the screams were louder than ever. They sounded to come from the east wing, nearer and nearer, close on the other side of the locked-up door, close behind them. Then I noticed the great bronze chandelier seemed all alight, though the hall was dim, and that a fire was blazing in the vast hearth-place, though it gave no heat. And I shuddered up with terror, and folded my darling closer to me. But as I did so, the east door shook, and she, suddenly struggling to get free from me, cried, "Hester, I must go! My little girl is there! I hear her! She is coming! Hester, I must go!" I held her tight with all my strength, with a set will. I held her. If I had died, my hands would have grasped her still. I was so resolved in my mind. Miss Furnivall stood listening, and paid no regard to my darling, who had got down on the ground, and whom I, upon my knees now, was holding with both my arms clasped round her neck, she still striving and crying to get free. All at once the east door gave way with a thundering crash, as if torn in a violent passion, and there came into that broad and mysterious light the figure of a tall old man, with gray hair and gleaming eyes. He drove before him with many a relentless gesture of abhorrence a stern and beautiful woman, with a little child clinging to her dress. "Oh, Hester, Hester!" cried Miss Rosamond. "It's the lady below the holly trees, and my little girl is with her. Hester, Hester, let me go with her. They are drawing me to them. I feel them, I must go." Again she was almost convulsed by her efforts to get away, but I held her tighter and tighter, till I feared I should do her a hurt, but rather than let her go towards the terrible phantoms. They passed along towards the great hall door, where the winds howled and ravened for their prey, but before they reached that, the lady turned, and I could see that she defied the old man with a fierce and proud defiance, but then she quailed, and then she threw up her arms wildly and piteously to save her child, her little child, from a blow from his uplifted crutch. And Miss Rosamond was torn as by a power stronger than mine, and writhed in my arms, and sobbed, for by this time the poor darling was growing faint. "They want me to go with them on to the fells. They are drawing me to them. Oh, my little girl, I would come, but cruel, wicked Hester holds me very tight. But when she saw the uplifted crutch, she swooned away, and I thanked God for it. Just at this moment, when the tall old man, his hair streaming as if in the blast of a furnace, was going to strike the little shrinking child, Miss Furnivall, the old woman by my side, cried out, "Oh, father, father, spare the little innocent child!" But just then we all saw, another phantom shape itself, and grow clear out of the blue and misty light that filled the hall. We had not seen her till now, for it was another lady who stood by the old man with a look of relentless hate and triumphant scorn. That figure was very beautiful to look upon, with a soft white hat drawn down over the proud brows and a red and curling lip. It was dressed in an open robe of blue satin. I had seen that figure before. It was the likeness of Miss Furnivall in her youth, and the terrible phantoms moved on, regardless of Miss Furnivall's wild entreaty, and the uplifted crutch fell on the right shoulder of the little child, and the younger sister looked on, stonely and deadly serene. But at that moment the dim lights and the fire that gave no heat went out of themselves, and Miss Furnivall laid at our feet, stricken down by the palsy, death-stricken. Yes, she was carried to her bed, that night never to rise again. She lay with her face to the wall, muttering low, but muttering always, "Alas! Alas! What is done in youth can never be undone in age. What is done in youth can never be undone in age." The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood. When the words "not guilty" sounded through the crowded courtroom that dark December afternoon, Arthur Wilbraham, the great criminal K.C. and leader for the triumphant defense, was represented by his junior. But Johnson, his private secretary, carried the verdict across to his chambers like lightning. "It's what we expected, I think," said the barrister, without emotion. "And personally, I am glad the case is over." There was no particular sign of pleasure that his defense of John Turk, the murderer on a plea of insanity, had been successful, for no doubt he felt, as everyone who had watched the case felt, that no man had ever better deserved the gallows. "I'm glad too," said Johnson. He had sat in the court for 10 days watching the face of the man who carried out with callous detail one of the most brutal and cold-blooded murders of recent years. The counsel glanced up at his secretary. They were more than employer and employed. For family and other reasons they were friends. "Ah, I remember, yes," he said with a kind smile. "And you want to get away for Christmas? You're going to skate and ski in the Alps, aren't you? If I was your age I'd come with you." Johnson laughed shortly. He was a young man of 26, with a delicate face like a girl's. "I can catch the morning boat now," he said, "but that's not the reason I'm glad the trial is over. I'm glad it's over because I've seen the last of that man's dreadful face. It positively haunted me. Bat-white skin, with the black hair brushed low over the forehead, is a thing I shall never forget, and the description of the way the dismembered body was crammed and packed with lime into that—" "Don't dwell on it, my dear fellow," interrupted the other, looking at him curiously out of his keen eyes. "Don't think about it. Such pictures have a trick of coming back when one least wants them." He paused a moment. "Now go," he added presently, "and enjoy your holiday. I shall want all your energy for my parliamentary work when you get back. And don't break your neck skiing." Johnson shook hands and took his leave. At the door he turned suddenly. "I knew there was something I wanted to ask you," he said. "Would you mind lending me one of your kit bags? It's too late to get one tonight, and I leave in the morning before the shops are open." "Of course. I'll send Henry over with it to your rooms. You shall have it the moment I get home." "I promise to take great care of it," said Johnson gratefully, delighted to think that within 30 hours he would be nearing the brilliant sunshine of the high Alps in winter. He thought of that criminal court was like an evil dream in his mind. He dined at his club and went on to Bloomsbury, where he occupied the top floor in one of those old gaunt houses in which the rooms are large and lofty. The floor below his own was vacant and unfinished, and below that were other lodgers whom he did not know. It was cheerless, and he looked forward heartily to a change. The night was even more cheerless. It was miserable, and few people were about. A cold, sleety rain was driving down the streets before the keenest east wind he had ever felt. It howled dismally among the big, gloomy houses of the great squares, and when he reached his rooms he heard it whistling and shouting over the world of black roofs beyond his windows. In the hall he met his landlady, shading a candle from the draughts with her thin hand. "This come by a way of Mr. Wilbraham's, sir." She pointed to what was evidently the kit-bag, and Johnson thanked her, and took it upstairs with him. "I shall be going abroad in the morning for 10 days, Mrs. Monks," he said. "I'll leave an address for letters." "And I hope you'll have a Merry Christmas, sir," she said, in a raucous, wheezy voice that suggested spirits, "and better weather than this." "I hope so too," replied her lodger, shuddering a little as the wind went roaring down the street outside. When he got upstairs, he heard the sleet volleying against the window-panes. He put his kettle on to make a cup of hot coffee, and then set about putting a few things in order for his absence. "And now I must pack, such as my packing is," he laughed to himself, and set to work at once. He liked the packing, for it brought the snow mountains so vividly before him, and made him forget the unpleasant scenes of the past 10 days. Besides, it was not elaborate in nature. His friend had lent him the very thing, a stout canvas kit-bag, sack-shaped, with holes round the neck for the brass bar and padlock. It was a bit shapeless, true, and not much to look at, but its capacity was unlimited, and there was no need to pack carefully. He shoved in his waterproof coat, his fur cap and gloves, his skates and climbing boots, his sweaters, snow boots and ear caps, and then on top of these he piled his woolen shirts and underwear, his thick socks, puttees, and knickerbockers. The dress suit came next, in case the hotel people dressed for dinner, and then, thinking of the best way to pack his white shirts, he paused a moment to reflect. "That's the worst of these kit-bags," he mused vaguely, standing in the center of the sitting-room, where he had come to fetch some string. It was after 10 o'clock. A furious gust of wind rattled the windows as though to hurry him up, and he thought with pity of the poor Londoners whose Christmas would be spent in such a climate, whilst he was skimming over snowy slopes in bright sunshine, and dancing in the evening with rosy-cheeked girls. Ah, that reminded him. He must put in his dancing pumps and evening socks. He crossed over from his sitting-room to the cupboard on the landing where he kept his linen. And as he did, so he heard someone coming softly up the stairs. He stood still a moment on the landing to listen. It wasn't Mrs. Monk's step, he thought. She must be coming up with the last post. But then the steps ceased suddenly, and he heard no more. They were at least 2 flights down, and he came to the conclusion they were too heavy to be those of his bibulous landlady. No doubt they belonged to a late lodger who had mistaken his floor. He went into his bedroom and packed his pumps and dress shirts as best he could. The kit-bag by this time was 2/3 full, and stood upright on its own base like a sack of flour. For the first time he noticed it was old and dirty, the canvas faded and worn, and that it had obviously been subjected to rather rough treatment. It was not a very nice bag to have sent him, certainly not a new one, or one that his chief valued. He gave the matter a passing thought, and went on with his packing. Once or twice, however, he caught himself wondering who it could have been wandering down below, for Mrs. Monks had not come up with letters, and the floor was empty and unfurnished. From time to time, moreover, he was almost certain he heard a soft tread of someone padding about over the bare boards, cautiously, stealthily, as silently as possible, and, further, that the sounds had been lately coming distinctly nearer. For the first time in his life, he began to feel a little creepy. Then, as though to emphasize this feeling, an odd thing happened. As he left the bedroom, having just packed his recalcitrant white shirts, he noticed that the top of the kit-bag lopped over towards him with an extraordinary resemblance to a human face. The camas fell into a fold like a nose and forehead, and the brass rings for the padlock just filled the position of the eyes. A shadow, or was it a travel stain, for he could not tell exactly, looked like hair. It gave him rather a turn, for it was so absurdly, so outrageously like the face of John Turk the murderer. He laughed and went to the front room, where the light was stronger. That horrid case has got on my mind, he thought. I shall be glad of a change of scene and air. In the sitting-room, however, he was not pleased to hear again that stealthy tread upon the stairs, and to realize that it was much closer than before, as well as unmistakably real. And this time he got up and went out to see who it could be creeping about on the upper staircase at so late an hour. But the sound ceased. There was no one visible on the stairs. He went to the floor below, not without trepidation, and turned on the electric light to make sure that no one was hiding in the empty rooms of the unoccupied suite. There was not a stick of furniture large enough to hide a dog. Then he called over the banisters to Mrs. Monk's, but there was no answer, and his voice echoed down into the dark vault of the house, and lost in the rear of the gale that howled outside. Everyone was in bed and asleep, everyone except himself and the owner of this soft and stealthy tread. My absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. It must have been the wind after all, although it seemed so very real and close. I thought. He went back to his packing. It was by this time getting on towards midnight. He drank his coffee up and lit another pipe, the last before turning in. It is difficult to say exactly at what point fear begins, when the causes of that fear are not plainly before the eyes. Impressions gather on the surface of the mind, film by film, as ice gathers upon the surface of still water, but often so lightly that they claim no definite recognition from the consciousness. Then a point is reached where the accumulated impressions become a definite emotion, and the mind realizes that something has happened. With something of a start, Johnson suddenly recognized that he felt nervous, oddly nervous. Also, that for some time past the causes of this feeling had been gathering slowly in his mind, but that he had only just reached the point where he was forced to acknowledge them. It was a singular and curious malaise that had come over him, and he hardly knew what to make of it. He felt as though he were doing something that was strongly objected to by another person, moreover, who had some right to object. It was a most disturbing and disagreeable feeling, not unlike the persistent promptings of conscience, almost, in fact, as if he were doing something he knew to be wrong. Yet, though he searched vigorously and honestly in his mind, he could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of this growing uneasiness, and it perplexed him. More, it distressed and frightened him. "Pure nerves, I suppose," he said aloud with a forced laugh. "Mountain air will cure all that. Ah," he added, still speaking to himself, "and that reminds me, my snow-glasses." He was standing by the door of the bedroom during this brief soliloquy, and as he passed quickly towards the sitting-room to fetch them from the cupboard, he saw out of the corner of his eye the indistinct outline of a figure standing on the stairs, a few feet from the top. It was someone in a stooping position, with one hand on the banisters and the face peering up towards the landing. And at the same moment he heard a shuffling footstep. The person who had been creeping about below all this time had at last come up to his own floor. Who in the world could it be? And what in the name of heaven did he want? Johnson caught his breath sharply and stood stock still. Then, after a few seconds' hesitation, he found his courage and turned to investigate. The stairs, he saw to his utter amazement, were empty. There was no one. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and something about the muscles of his legs gave a little and grew weak. For the space of several minutes he peered steadily into the shadows that congregated about the top of the staircase where he had seen the figure, and then he walked fast, almost ran in fact, into the light of the front room. But hardly had he passed inside the doorway when he heard someone come up the stairs behind him with a quick bound and go swiftly into his bedroom. It was a heavy, but at the same time a stealthy footstep, the tread of somebody who did not wish to be seen. And it was at this precise moment that the nervousness he had hitherto experienced leaped the boundary line and entered this state of fear, almost of acute, unreasoning fear. Before it turned into terror, there was a further boundary to cross, and beyond that again lay the region of pure horror. Johnson's position was an unenviable one. "By Jove, that was someone on the stairs then," he muttered, his flesh crawling all over. "And whoever it was has now gone into my bedroom." His delicate pale face turned absolutely white, and for some minutes he hardly knew what to do or think. Then he realized intuitively that delay only set a premium upon fear, and he crossed the landing boldly and went straight into the other room, where, a few seconds before, the steps had disappeared. "Who's there? Is that you, Mrs. Monks?" he called aloud, as he went, and heard the first half of his words echo down the empty stairs, while the second half fell dead against the curtains in a room that apparently held no other human figure than his own. "Who's there?" he called again, and a voice unnecessarily loud that only just held firm. "What do you want here?" The curtain swayed very slightly, and as he saw it, his heart felt as if it almost missed a beat. Yet he dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. A window, streaming with rain, was all that met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards held nothing but rows of clothes, hanging motionless, and under the bed there was no sign of anyone hiding. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and as he did so, something all but tripped him up. Turning with a sudden spring of alarm, he saw the kit-bag. "Odd," he thought, "that's not where I left it." A few moments before, it had surely been on his right, between the bed and the bath. He did not remember having moved it. It was very curious. What in the world was the matter with everything? Were all his senses gone queer? A terrific gust of wind tore at the windows, dashing the sleet against the glass with the force of small gunshot, and then fled away howling dismally over the waste of Bloomsbury roofs. A sudden vision of the Channel next day rose in his mind and recalled him sharply to his realities. "There's no one here, at any rate, that's quite clear," he exclaimed aloud. Yet at the time he uttered them he knew perfectly well that his words were not true, and that he did not believe them himself. He felt exactly as though someone was hiding close about him, watching all his movements, trying to hinder his packing in some way. "And two of my senses," he added, keeping up the pretense, "have played me the most absurd tricks. The steps I heard and the figure I saw were both entirely imaginary." He went back to the front room, poked the fire into a blaze, and sat down before it to think. What impressed him more than anything else, the fact that the kit-bag was no longer where he had left it. It had been dragged nearer to the door. What happened afterwards that night happened, of course, to a man already excited by fear, and was perceived by a mind that had not the full and proper control, therefore, of the senses. Outwardly, Johnson remained calm and master of himself to the end, pretending to the very last that everything he witnessed had a natural explanation, or was merely delusions of his tired nerves. But inwardly, in his very heart, he knew all along that someone had been hiding downstairs in the empty suite when he came in, that this person had watched his opportunity and then stealthily made his way up to the bedroom, and that all he saw and heard afterwards, from the moving of the kit-bag to the other things the story has to tell, were caused directly by the presence of this invisible person. And it was here, just when he most desired to keep his mind and thoughts controlled, that the vivid pictures received day after day upon the mental plates exposed in the courtroom of the Old Bailey came strongly to light and developed themselves in the dark room of his inner vision. Unpleasant, haunting memories have a way of coming to life just when the mind least desires them. In the silent watches of the night, on sleepless pillows, during the lonely hours spent by sick and dying beds. And so now Johnson, in the same way, saw nothing but the dreadful face of John Turk, the murderer, lowering at him from every corner of his mental field of vision, the white skin, the evil eyes, and the fringe of black hair low over the forehead. All the pictures of those 10 days in court crowded back into his mind unbidden, and very vivid. "This is all rubbish and nerves," he exclaimed at length, springing with sudden energy from his chair. "I shall finish my packing and go to bed. I'm overwrought, overtired. No doubt at this rate I shall hear steps and things all night." But his face was deadly white all the same. He snatched up his field glasses and walked across to the bedroom, humming a music-hall song as he went, a trifle too loud to be natural. And the instant he crossed the threshold and stood within the room, something turned cold about his heart, and he felt that every hair on his head stood up. The kit-bag lay close in front of him, several feet nearer to the door than he had left it, and just over its crumpled top he saw a head and face slowly sinking down out of sight, as though someone were crouching behind it to hide. And at the same moment a sound like a long-drawn sigh was distinctly audible in the still air about him between the gusts of the storm outside. Johnson had more courage and willpower than the girlish indecision of his face indicated, but at first such a wave of terror came over him that for some seconds he could do nothing but stand and stare. A violent trembling ran down his back and legs, and he was conscious of a foolish, almost a hysterical impulse to scream aloud. That sigh seemed in his very ear, and the air still quivered with it. It was unmistakably a human sigh. "Who's there?" he said at length, finding his voice, but thought he meant to speak with loud decision. The tones came out instead in a faint whisper, for he had partly lost the control of his tongue and lips. He stepped forward so that he could see all round and over the kit-bag. Of course, there was nothing there, nothing but the faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands and threw open the mouth of the sack where it had fallen over, being only 3 pots full, and then he saw for the first time that round the inside, some 6 inches from the top, there ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was an old and faded blood stain. He uttered a scream and drew back his hands as if they had been burnt. At the same moment the kit-bag gave a faint but unmistakable lurch towards the front door. Johnson collapsed backwards, searching with his hands for the support of something solid, and the door, being further behind him than he realized, received his weight just in time to prevent his falling, and shut to with a resounding bang. At the same moment the swinging of his left arm accidentally touched the electric switch, and the light in the room went out. It was an awkward and disagreeable predicament, and if Johnson had not been possessed of real pluck, he might have done all manner of foolish things. As it was, however, he pulled himself together and groped furiously for the little brass knob to turn the light on again. But the rapid closing of the door had set the coats hanging on it a-swinging, and his fingers became entangled in a confusion of sleeves and pockets, so that it was some moments before he found the switch. And in those few moments of bewilderment and terror, 2 things happened that sent him beyond recall over the boundary into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit-bag shuffling heavily across the floor in jerks, and close in front of his face sounded once again the sigh of a human being. In his anguished efforts to find the brass button on the wall, he nearly scraped the nails from his fingers, but even then, in those frenzied moments of alarm, so swift and alert are the impressions of the mind, keyed up by a vivid emotion, he had time to realize that he dreaded the return of the light, and that it might be better for him to stay hidden in the merciful screen of darkness. It was but the impulse of a moment, however, and before he had time to act upon it, he had yielded automatically to the original desire, and the room was flooded again with light. But the second instinct had been right. It would have been better for him to have stayed in the shelter of the kind darkness, for there, close before him, bending over the half-packed kit-bag, clear as life in the merciless glare of the electric light, stood the figure of John Turk, the murderer. Not 3 feet from him the man stood, the fringe of black hair marked plainly against the pallor of the forehead, the whole horrible presentment of the scoundrel, as vivid as he had seen him day after day in the Old Valley, when he stood there in the dock, cynical and callous, under the very shadow of the gallows. In a flash, Johnson realized what it all meant. The dirty and much-used bag, the smear of crimson within the top, the dreadful stretched condition of the bulging sides. He remembered how the victim's body had been stuffed into a canvas bag for burial, the ghastly, dismembered fragments forced with lime into this very bag, and the bag itself produced as evidence. It all came back to him as clear as day. Very softly and stealthily, his hand groped behind him for the handle of the door. But before he could actually turn it, the very thing that he most of all dreaded came about, and John Turk lifted his devil's face and looked at him. At the same moment, that heavy sigh passed through the air of the room, formulated somehow into words. "It's my bag, and I want it." Johnson just remembered clawing the door open and then falling in a heap upon the floor of the landing as he tried frantically to make his way into the front room. He remained unconscious for a long time, and it was still dark when he opened his eyes and realized he was lying, stiff and bruised on the cold boards. Then the memory of what he had seen rushed back into his mind, and he promptly fainted again. When he woke the second time, the wintry dawn was just beginning to peep in at the windows, painting the stairs a cheerless, dismal gray, and he managed to crawl into the front room and cover himself with an overcoat in the armchair, where at length he fell asleep. A great clamor woke him. He recognized Mrs. Monk's voice, loud and voluble. "What? You ain't been to bed, sir? Are you ill, or has anything happened? And there's an urgent gentleman to see you, though it ain't 7 o'clock yet. And—" Who is it?" he stammered. "I'm all right, thanks. Fell asleep in my chair, I suppose." "Someone from Mr. Wilbrham's, and he says he ought to see you quick before you go abroad. And I told him—" "Show him up, please, at once," said Johnson, whose head was whirling, and his mind was still full of dreadful visions. Mr. Wilbraham's man came in with many apologies, and explained briefly and quickly that an absurd mistake had been made, and that the wrong kit-bag had been sent over the night before. Henry somehow got hold of the one that came over from the courtroom, and Mr. Wilbraham only discovered it when he saw his own lying in his room, and asked why it had not gone to you, the man said. "Oh," said Johnson stupidly. "And he must have brought you the one from the murder case instead, sir, I'm afraid," the man continued, without the ghost of an expression on his face. "The one John Turk packed the dead both in. Mr. Wilbraham's awful upset about it, sir, and told me to come over first thing this morning with the right one, as you were leaving by the boat." He pointed to a clean-looking kit-bag on the floor, which he had just brought. "And I was to bring the other one back, sir," he added casually. For some minutes Johnson could not find his voice. At last he pointed in the direction of his bedroom. "Perhaps you would kindly unpack it for me. Just empty the things out onto the floor." The man disappeared into the other room, and was gone for 5 minutes. Johnson heard the shifting to and fro of the bag, and the rattle of the skates and boots being unpacked. "Thank you, sir," the man said, returning with the bag folded over his arm. "And can I do anything more to help you, sir?" "What is it?" asked Johnson, seeing that he still had something he wished to say. The man shifted and looked mysterious. "Beg pardon, sir, but knowing your interest in the Turk's case, I thought you'd maybe like to know what's happened." "Yes. John Turk killed himself last night with poison immediately on getting his release, and he left a note from Mr. Wilbraham saying as he'd be much obliged if they'd have him put away, same as the woman he murdered, in the old kit-bag." "What time did he do it?" asked Johnson. 10 o'clock last night, sir, the warder says.
The Festival by H.P. Lovecraft. I was far from home, and the spell of the eastern sea was upon me. In the twilight I heard it pounding on the rocks, and I knew it lay just over the hill where the twisting willows writhed against the clearing sky and the first stars of evening. And because my fathers had called me to the old town beyond, I pushed on through the shallow new-fallen snow along the road that soared lonely up to where Aldebaran twinkled among the trees, on toward the very ancient town I had never seen but often dreamed of. It was the Yuletide, that men call Christmas, though They know in their hearts it is older than Bethlehem and Babylon, older than Memphis and mankind. It was the Yuletide, and I had come at last to the ancient sea town where my people had dwelt and kept festival in the elder time when festival was forbidden, where also they had commanded their sons to keep festival once every century, that the memory of primal secrets might not be forgotten. Mine were an old people, and were old even when this land was settled 300 years before. And they were strange because they had come as dark furtive folk from opiate southern gardens of orchids, and spoken another tongue before they learnt the tongue of the blue-eyed fishers. And now they were scattered, and shared only the rituals of mysteries that none living could understand. I was the only one who came back that night to the old fishing town as legend bade, for only the poor and the lonely remember. Then beyond the hill's crest I saw Kingsport outspread frostily in the gloaming. Snowy Kingsport with its ancient vanes and steeples, ridge-poles and chimney-pots, wharves and small bridges, willow trees and graveyards, endless labyrinths of steep, narrow, crooked streets, and dizzy church-crowned central peak that time durst not touch. Ceaseless mazes of colonial houses piled and scattered at all angles and levels like a child's disordered blocks. Antiquity hovering on gray wings over winter-whitened gables and gambrel roofs. Fan lights and small-pane windows, one by one gleaming out in the cold dusk to join Orion and the archaic stars. And against the rotting wharves the sea pounded, the secretive, immemorial sea out of which the people had come in the elder time. Beside the road at its crest a still higher summit rose, bleak and windswept, and I saw that it was a burying ground where black gravestones stuck ghoulishly through the snow like the decayed fingernails of a gigantic corpse. The printless road was very lonely, and sometimes I thought I heard a distant horrible creaking as of a gibbet in the wind. They had hanged 4 kinsmen of mine for witchcraft in 1692, but I did not know just where. As the road wound down the seaward slope, I listened for the merry sounds of a village at evening, but did not hear them. Then I thought of the season, and felt that these old Puritan folk might well have Christmas customs strange to me, and full of silent hearthside prayer. So after that I did not listen for a merriment or look for wayfarers, but kept on down past the hushed, lighted farmhouses and shadowy stone walls to where the signs of ancient shops and sea taverns creaked in the salt breeze, and the grotesque knockers of pillared doorways glistened along deserted, unpaved lanes in the light of little curtained windows. I had seen maps of the town and knew where to find the home of my people. It was told that I should be known and welcomed, for village legend lives long. So I hastened through back street to Circle Court, and across the fresh snow on the one full flagstone pavement in the town, to where Green Lane leads off behind the market house. The old map still held good, and I had no trouble, though at Arkham they must have lied when they said the trolleys ran to this place, since I saw not a wire overhead. Snow would have hid the rails in any case. I was glad I had chosen to walk, for the white village had seemed very beautiful from the hill, and now I was eager to knock at the door of my people, the 7th house on the left in Green Lane, with an ancient peaked roof and jutting 2nd story, all built before 1650. There were lights inside the house when I came upon it, and I saw from the diamond window panes that it must have been kept very close to its antique state. The upper part overhung the narrow grass-grown street and nearly met the overhanging part of the house opposite, so that I was almost in a tunnel, with the low stone doorstep wholly free from snow. There was no sidewalk, but many houses had high doors reached by double flights of steps with their iron railings. It was an odd scene, and because I was strange to New England, I had never known its like before. Though it pleased me, I would have relished it better if there had been footprints in the snow, and people in the streets, and a few windows without drawn curtains. When I sounded the archaic iron knocker, I was half afraid. Some fear had been gathering in me, perhaps because of the strangeness of my heritage, and the bleakness of the evening, and the queerness of the silence in that aged town of curious customs. And when my knock was answered, I was fully afraid, because I had not heard any footsteps before the door creaked open. But I was not afraid long, for the gowned, slippered old man in the doorway had a bland face that reassured me, and though he made signs that he was dumb, he wrote a quaint and ancient welcome with the stylus and wax tablet he carried. He beckoned me into a low, candlelit room with massive exposed rafters and dark, stiff, sparse furniture of the 17th century. The past was vivid there, for not an attribute was missing. There was a cavernous fireplace and a spinning wheel at which bent an old woman in loose wrapper and deep poke bonnet sat back toward me, silently spinning despite the festive season. An indefinite dampness seemed upon the place, and I marveled that no fire should be blazing. The high-backed settle faced the row of curtained windows at the left, and seemed to be occupied, though I was not sure. I did not like everything about what I saw, and felt again the fear I had had. This fear grew stronger from what had before lessened it, for the more I looked at the old man's bland face, the more its very blandness terrified me. The eyes never moved, and the skin was too like wax. Finally, I was sure it was not a face at all, but a fiendishly cunning mask. But the flabby hands, curiously gloved, wrote genially on the tablet, and told me I must wait a while before I could be led to the place of festival. Pointing to a chair, table, and pile of books, the old man now left the room, and when I sat down to read, I saw that the books were hoary and moldy, and that they included old Morister's wild Marvels of Science, the terrible Seducimus Triumphus of Joseph Glanville, published in 1681, the shocking Demolatria of Dramigus, printed in 1595 at Lyons, and worst of all, the unmentionable Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in Olaus Wormvius' forbidden Latin translation, a book which I had never seen, but of which I had heard monstrous things whispered. No one spoke to me, but I could hear the creaking of signs in the wind outside, and the whir of the wheel as the bonneted old woman continued her silent spinning. I thought the room and the books and the people very morbid and disquieting, but because an old tradition of my father's had summoned me to strange feastings, I resolved to expect queer things. So I tried to read, and soon became tremblingly absorbed by something I found in that accursed Necronomicon, a thought and a legend too hideous for sanity or consciousness. But I disliked it when I fancied I heard the closing of one of the windows that the settle faced, as if it had been stealthily opened. It had seemed to follow a whirring that was not of the old woman's spinning wheel. This was not much, though, for the old woman was spinning very hard, and the aged clock had been striking. After that, I lost the feeling that there were persons on the settle, and was reading intently and shudderingly when the old man came back booted and dressed in a loose antique costume, and sat down on that very bench, so that I could not see him. It was certainly nervous waiting, and the blasphemous book in my hands made it doubly so. When 11 struck, however, the old man stood up, glided to a massive carved chest in a corner, and got 2 hooded cloaks, one of which he donned and the other of which he draped round the old woman. Then they both started for the outer door, the woman lamely creeping, and the old man, after picking up the very book I had been reading, beckoning me as he drew his hood over that unmoving face or mask. We went out into the moonless and tortuous network of that incredibly ancient town, went out as the lights in the curtained windows disappeared one by one. and the dog star leered at the throng of cowled, cloaked figures that poured silently from every doorway and formed monstrous processions up this street and that, past the creaking signs and antediluvian gables, the thatched roofs and diamond-paned windows, threading precipitous lanes where decaying houses overlapped and crumbled together, gliding across open courts and churchyards where the bobbing lanterns made eldritch drunken constellations. Amid these hushed throngs I followed my voiceless guides, jostled by elbows that seemed preternaturally soft, and pressed by chests and stomachs that seemed abnormally pulpy, but seeing never a face and hearing never a word. Up, up, up the eerie columns slithered, and I saw that all the travelers were converging as they flowed near a sort of focus of crazy alleys at the top of a high hill in the center of the town, where perched a great white church. I had seen it from the road's crest when I looked at Kingsport in the new dusk, and it had made me shiver because Aldebaran had seemed to balance itself a moment on the ghostly spire. There was an open space around the church, partly a churchyard with spectral shafts, and partly a half-paved square swept nearly bare of snow by the wind, and lined with unwholesomely archaic houses, having peaked roofs and overhanging gables. Death fires danced over the tombs, revealing gruesome vistas, though queerly failing to cast any shadows. Past the churchyard, where there were no houses, I could see over the hill's summit and watch the glimmer of stars on the harbor, though the town was invisible in the dark. Only once in a while a lanthorn bobbed horribly through serpentine alleys on its way to overtake the throng that was now slipping speechlessly into the church. I waited till the crowd had oozed into the black doorway, and till all the stragglers had followed. The old man was pulling at my sleeve, but I was determined to be the last. Then I finally went, the sinister man and the old spinning woman before me. Crossing the threshold into that swarming temple of unknown darkness, I turned once to look at the outside world as the churchyard phosphorescence cast a sickly glow on the hilltop pavement. And as I did so I shuddered, for though the wind had not left much snow, a few patches did remain on the path near the door, and in that fleeting backward look it seemed to my troubled eyes that they bore no mark of passing feet, not even mine. The church was scarce lighted by all the lanthorns that had entered it, for most of the throng had already vanished. They had streamed up the aisle between the high white pews to the trap door of the vaults which yawned loathsomely open just before the pulpit, and were now squirming noiselessly in. I followed dumbly down the foot-worn steps and into the dark, suffocating crypt. The tale of that sinuous line of night marchers seemed very horrible, and as I saw them wriggling into a venerable tomb, they seemed more horrible still. Then I noticed that the tomb's floor had an aperture down which the throng was sliding, and in a moment we were all descending an ominous staircase of rough-hewn stone, a narrow spiral staircase, damp and peculiarly odorous, that wound endlessly down into the bowels of the hill, past monotonous walls of dripping stone blocks and crumbling mortar. It was a silent, shocking descent, and I observed after a horrible interval that the walls and steps were changing in nature, as if chiseled out of the solid rock. What mainly troubled me was that the myriad footfalls made no sound and set up no echoes. After more aeons of descent, I saw some side passages or burrows leading from unknown recesses of blackness to this shaft of nighted mystery. Soon they became excessively numerous, like impious catacombs of nameless menace, and their pungent odor of decay grew quite unbearable. I knew we must have passed down through the mountain and beneath the earth of Kingsport itself, and I shivered that a town should be so aged and maggoty with subterraneous evil. Then I saw a lurid shimmering of pale light and heard the insidious lapping of sunless waters.
Again I shivered, for I did not like the things that the night had brought, and wished bitterly that no forefather had summoned me to this primal rite. As the steps in the passage grew broader, I heard another sound, the thin, whining mockery of a feeble flute. And suddenly there spread out before me the boundless vista of an inner world, a vast fungus shore litten by a belching column of sick greenish flame and washed by a wide oily river that flowed from abysses frightful and unexpected to join the blackest gulfs of immemorial ocean. Fainting and gasping, I looked at that unhallowed Erebus of Titan toadstools, leprous fire, and slimy water, and saw the cloaked throngs forming a semicircle around the blazing pillar. It was the Yule rite, older than man and fated to survive him, the primal rite of the solstice and of spring's promise beyond the snows, the rite of fire and evergreen, light and music. And in the Stygian grotto I saw them do the rite, and adore the sick pillar of flame, and throw into the water handfuls gouged out of the viscous vegetation which glittered green in the caloric glare. I saw this, and I saw something amorphously squatted far away from the light, piping noisomely on a flute, and as the thing piped I thought I heard noxious muffled flutterings in the fetid darkness where I could not see. But what frightened me most was that flaming column, spouting volcanically from depths profound and inconceivable, casting no shadows as healthy flame should, and coating the nitrous stone above with a nasty venomous verdigris. For in all that seething combustion no warmth lay, but only the clamminess of death and corruption. The man who had brought me now squirmed to a point directly beside the hideous flame, and made stiff ceremonial motions to the semicircle he faced. At certain stages of the ritual they did groveling obeisance, especially when he held above his head that abhorrent Necronomicon he had taken with him. And I shared all the obeisances, because I had been summoned to the festival by the writings of my forefathers. Then the old man made a signal to the half-seen flute player in the darkness, which player thereupon changed its feeble drone to a scarce louder drone in another key, precipitating as it did so a horror unthinkable and unexpected. At this horror I sank nearly to the lichened earth, transfixed with a dread not of this nor any world, but only of the mad spaces between the stars. Out of the unimaginable blackness beyond the gangrenous glare of that cold flame, out of the Tartarian leagues through which that oily river rolled uncanny, unheard and unsuspected, there flopped rhythmically a horde of tame, trained, hybrid-winged things that no sound eye could ever wholly grasp, or sound brain ever wholly remember. They were not altogether crows, nor moles, nor buzzards, nor ants, nor vampire bats, nor decomposed human beings, but something I cannot and must not recall. They flopped limply along, half with their webbed feet and half with their membranous wings. And as they reached, the throng of celebrants and cowled figures seized and mounted them, and rode off one by one along the reaches of that unlighted river, into pits and galleries of panic, where poison springs feed frightful and undiscoverable cataracts. The old spinning woman had gone with the throng, and the old man remained only because I had refused when he motioned me to seize an animal and ride it like the rest. I saw when I staggered to my feet that the amorphous flute player had rolled out of sight, but that two of the beasts were patiently standing by. As I hung back, the old man produced his stylus and tablet and wrote that he was the true deputy of my fathers, who had founded the Yule worship in this ancient place, that it had been decreed that I should come back, and that the most secret mysteries were yet to be performed. He wrote this in a very ancient hand, and when I still hesitated, he pulled from his loose robe a seal ring and a watch, both with my family arms, to prove that he was what he said. But it was a hideous proof, because I knew from old papers that that watch had been buried with my great-great-great-great-grandfather in 1698. Presently, The old man drew back his hood and pointed to the family resemblance in his face, but I only shuddered, because I was sure that the face was merely a devilish waxen mask. The flopping animals were now scratching restlessly at the lichens, and I saw that the old man was nearly as restless himself. When one of the things began to waddle and edge away, he turned quickly to stop it, so that the suddenness of his motion dislodged the waxen mask from what should have been his head. And then, because that nightmare's position barred me from the stone staircase down which we had come, I flung myself into the oily underground river that bubbled somewhere to the caves of the sea, flung myself into that putrescent juice of earth's inner horrors before the madness of my screams could bring down upon me all the charnel legions these pest gulfs might conceal. At the hospital, they told me that I had been found half frozen in Kingsport Harbor at dawn, clinging to the drifting spar that accident sent to save me. They told me I had taken the wrong fork on the hill road the night before, and fallen over the cliffs at Orange Point, a thing they deduced from prints found in the snow. There was nothing I could say because everything was wrong. Everything was wrong with the broad window shewing a sea of roofs in which only about 1 in 5 was ancient, and the sound of trolleys and motors in the streets below. They insisted that this was Kingsport, and I could not deny it. When I went delirious at hearing that the hospital stood near the old churchyard on Central Hill, they sent me to St. Mary's Hospital in Arkham, where I could have better care. I liked it there, for the doctors were broad-minded, and even lent me their influence in obtaining the carefully sheltered copy of Alhazred's objectionable Necronomicon from the library of Miskatonic University. They said something about a psychosis, and agreed I had better get any harassing obsessions off my mind. So I read again that hideous chapter, and shuddered doubly because it was indeed not new to me. I had seen it before. Let footprints tell what they might, and where it was I had seen it were best forgotten. There was no one else in waking hours who could remind me of it, but my dreams are filled with terror, because of phrases I dare not quote. I dare quote only one paragraph, put into English as I can make from the awkward low Latin. "The nethermost caverns," wrote the mad Arab, "are not for the fathoming of eyes that see, for their marvels are strange and terrific. Cursed the ground where dead thoughts live new and oddly bodied, and evil the mind that is held by no head. Wisely did Ibn Sakabak say that happy is the tomb where no wizard hath lain, and happy the town at night whose wizards are all ashes. For it is of old rumor that the soul of the devil-bought hastes not from his charnel clay, but fats and instructs the very worm that gnaws, till out of corruption horrid life springs, and the dull scavengers of earth wax crafty to vex it, and swell monstrous to plague it. Great holes secretly are digged where earth's pores ought to suffice, and things have learnt to walk that ought to crawl."
And now I bid you a restless night. May you cower in the corner until morning's light, and in the harsh daylight you will see no one really gets out of jail free. This is Mr. Crispy,